So let me just start by briefly introducing what this was about, even though you all know. Ethics in whole brain emulation and mind uploading. We're trying to put together an ethics framework. So a framework that is supposed to help researchers and those who make policy, society as a whole, patients in the future, to grapple with all matters relating to whole brain emulation and all the other technologies that come along the way and the effects that those have. In order to do that, we're trying to collect a bunch of information and we're trying to dig into topics ourselves in a useful way. And we thought it would be great to utilize a process that I heard about from Andrew Sandberg, who tends to run sessions where they either do scenario brainstorming or wargaming or things like that to go through a few situations that you can imagine happening. And so we decided to use a similar process. And this is actually just the first in a sequence of these events. The second event is going to be an event that Anders is actually going to moderate, and we'll invite a number of experts from different areas to join that one, as well as the general public, at least as viewers, maybe also in some cases as participants. So this is kind of our first try to see how that works and what we might have to modify to make it all smooth. So please bear with us if things aren't always very smooth. It doesn't have to be a literal debate in which everybody is going at one another, but it'd be great if there was a lively discussion that we can learn from, and we'll try to get that going by sort of prodding you, by giving you a little go at each of the topics. Now, what's going to happen is that we have 6 topics on hand, and we have a time span set aside from 10 to noon Pacific time. So we have room for about 15 minutes of discussion for each topic. I'm going to have a timer handy for that. And then there'll be about 5 minutes in between where we can still have a little Q&A or conversation or just a pause and then go on to the next. Hopefully that will be enough. Now for each of the topics, what's going to happen is that Mirinda will read the topic to us so that everybody has read it, everybody has heard it, and then we'll start discussing it. So if that's fine with everyone, then I think we can get going. But the first thing we'll do before we get into a topic is we're going to have a little round of introductions. So I'm going to give the example by just introducing myself in 2 sentences or something similar. You don't have to count the sentences, of course. Hi, my name is Randall Kuhne. I'm a neuroscientist and the founder of the Carbon Copies Foundation, and my interest is whole brain emulation, has been for a very long time, and I'm involved with that in a variety of different ways, and one of them is this ethics framework, and I'm very glad to see you all here. Now let me pass the speaking stick, the baton, off to Mirinda.
Hi everyone, my name is Mirinda. I'm a master's in philosophy, specifically philosophy of neuroscience and philosophy of mind. And I joined Carbon Copies maybe 4 months ago, and I work in the ethics department.
All right. I will now give the baton to Bryce.
Okay, first of all, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Just making sure. So hello, my name is Bryce Counts. I'm a philosophy PhD student. My interests are in computational neuroscience and AI neural networks.
Fantastic. Next up, Deb.
Hi everyone, my name is Deb Debnath. I am a machine learning engineer in my day job, and my interests are mainly computer vision, but then I've been recently getting interested into computational neuroscience, and I've been volunteering for the BrainGenic software for about 6 months now. So, yeah.
Thank you. Alex, are you able to talk? Alexander.
Yes, hi, this is Alex. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Alex. My day job involves IT programming, and I'm involved with Carbon Copy. I've been involved with Carbon Copy for a while with a variety of different interests, and one interest I have is ethics, so I appreciate being here.
Thank you. Wonderful. Emily.
Hi. I'm on the design team, and I joined Carbon Copies about 2 or 3 months ago.
That's great. And welcome, Farhan.
Hi, my name is Farhan Lakhani. I'm a philosopher at the University of Iowa, and I work in philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, and I do some work in ethics as well.
Thank you. Jesse, is your mic working?
Hi, I'm Jesse Pearson. I've been also involved with Carbon Copies for a few years, and I also had went to an unusual school, but the easiest way to summarize is just saying it's a philosophy major, sort of ancient, with also a strong interest in philosophy of mind, and I'm very interested in hearing the debate today.
Awesome. Thanks. Keith.
Good morning. Let's see. So I'm primarily a data scientist and a software engineer. I have also mostly written a whole bunch of philosophical essays and a book on mind uploading, although I tend to be a little less involved in the organization than I wish I was, always looking for my way back into a project. But mostly I write.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. Minda.
Yeah, so I'm Minda. I'm an AI research engineer, and I'm currently actually staying over at John's lab, John Schlendorn, Randall, and I'm helping out with, so John's working on the Plan B, which is body replacement.
Right.
So I'm a visiting scholar there right now, and Randall and I know each other back from the Halcyon days.
Oh yeah, that's a long time. That's back
Which
from
is a long
2012, 2011, sometime like that, yeah.
Totally. So it's definitely, that's a while back. And, I've been in and out of these topics for a little while, but, being at John's lab, has me, re-engaging. So, I'm very excited to be here.
It's great to see you.
Thanks. Good to see
you. Richard.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Richard.
Hello. I'm Richard Gachalian, software engineer person. My interests are large language models and web development mainly. And then, I'm excited for the panel discussion.
Awesome. Samuel, great to have you.
It's awesome to be here again. I'm Sam. I'm building a VR startup that's bringing these high channel count brain-computer interfaces that are implanted into the metaverse. I'm exploring these topics. I think they are pretty much following the track of gradual replacement for whole brain emulation. And I've been on and off with Carbon Copies for about, 7 years now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think the last person is Trainee.
Hi, I'm T. Lamb, and I'm friends with you on Facebook, Randall. So I teach philosophy. I teach philosophy in Houston, Texas, and my specialty is philosophy of science and ethics. And I look forward to learning more about this topic.
Awesome. Okay, thanks everybody. Then I'm now going to hand it over to Mirinda to start us off on our first topic.
Okay, so the first topic relates to copies and consent. So a fundamental ethical concern surrounding the use of uploaded minds is the issue of consent. Imagine an individual named Adam makes 10 digital copies of himself to put to work at his startup. The emulations work around the clock to build Adam's company. Once the company is built, Adam offloads the data from the emulations and disposes of the copies. Presumably, the conscious emulations that Adam created to work at his startup did not provide informed consent to be used for work in such a manner before Adam created them. This unconsented use of labor of a sentient being, that is Adam's emulations, raises ethical concerns. Even though the emulations Adam is creating are a reflection of his own mind, the individual iterations of his mind that he creates, the 10 emulations, did not give their consent to work at his startup. Would it be unethical or even illegal to force the emulations to work without first getting their consent? Relatedly, without clear guidelines and protocols for obtaining informed consent before the upload procedure begins, individuals may be subjected to having their consciousness digitized and used for purposes they did not agree to during their lifetime. For example, doing work which the original person would have despised or would have found to be extremely boring or unethical, or being used in a way which causes the emulation psychological distress. This raises questions about personal autonomy and the right to control one's own identity and personal data even after death.
Thank you. Now, the floor is open and the timer is running. So anyone who has thoughts on this, please feel free to raise your hand. If it's not necessary, I prefer not to be the first one, but please go ahead. Yes, Bryce.
Yeah. So one thing I think about when we talk about this topic is if it would be possible to. Sorry, I got a notification here. It says something about my audio. You can all hear me still, right?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Okay. So if we could get enough conscious, so imagine we have some kind of like emulation, and we get enough conscious behavior so that the emulation is useful for us. In this case, as a copy of Adam. Could we get enough, useful behavior that we're calling conscious without sort of the actual subjective experience part that we worry about sort of oppressing in this case? So I'm thinking maybe consciousness is not, something that's going to come along with emulation necessarily. Maybe we identify it being, requiring certain components, and we can sort of leave those components out and just keep the ones we need for the useful task that we're considering in this case. I don't know if that makes sense, but more of a, I guess, technical issue.
It sounds like you're saying that your preferred version is one where you can still do the things that you wanted to do by creating these copies, but you do it unconsciously by, say, running 10 versions of some part of your brain processes that are necessary to do that thing, but then not require consciousness for it. Okay. I see Jesse already has his hand up. Maybe there's a response in there or another idea.
I'm wondering how you identify which parts you can emulate, how you identify whether or not consciousness exists in what has been emulated.
That's a good question. That's very close to what was in my mind listening to Bryce's suggestion, which is, this does require a very good understanding of consciousness and of what it means to either have a certain level or no consciousness, whether those are even binary or on some kind of a scale with degrees, and how that applies to certain parts of the brain and what they do. And then the question of, is this even a task that you could carry out unconsciously, or does it require consciousness to do the task? So there are a number of potential constraints there. Richard.
I'm of the belief that it's not possible to measure consciousness using like electrical impulses or whatnot. And so it's, I guess, not possible to know whether or not consciousness exists. Or like
That's interesting. So you're saying, for example, you couldn't use something like an MRI or an EEG or whatever to tell whether a patient is unconscious or conscious?
Okay. Maybe consciousness is the wrong word, but like I'm saying that like the thoughts that you generate aren't measurable, maybe, or like they're difficult. It's difficult to find out where these thoughts are generated from.
Okay, so we've got a number of different questions there. You're saying either that the thoughts themselves can't be determined from an external non-invasive, say, electrical recording, or maybe an invasive one even. And the other one is you're saying it's hard to locate them, which is doubly interesting.
If not impossible, yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, I understand what you're saying. Now, of course, we have examples like, for example, Jack Gallant's work trying to reconstruct what people see or imagine they're seeing or dreaming, where he reconstructs images or even videos that are trying to show what's going on in a person's visual center. Now, that's maybe not answering the entire question because it's based on having trained a machine, sort of machine learning tool and AI to be able to recognize the data from the MRI associated with certain visual events for that particular patient. So it's maybe a little bit of a cheat, but not entirely. But I like where this is going because it ties into, this problem of being able to say, well, this particular piece of activity in the brain means X because it only means X in the context of an entire sort of decoding sequence, a whole waterfall of other parts of the brain operating on something. So I can see where that might be a problem. Yeah, interesting. Any more thoughts? Oh, Alex, you've got something.
Yeah, this is Alex. So I was thinking is that maybe it depends on the person themselves. Maybe one person, doesn't care if you make 10 copies. It's fine. It's no problem. You can force the 10 copies to work for 2 days and then turn them off. Maybe that might not be a problem, but then another person maybe will have an issue with it. So one person may say, like, it's fine for the person themselves and that personality, but another person may say no, and so maybe that's a conflict there. So one person who decides, they don't want that, then they could make a law to pass or make that illegal. So really it just depends on, like, how or why that person should decide if it's ethical or not. Maybe the other person could decide, yeah, it's ethical, but how would you resolve that conflict?
Oh, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that was interesting, and I thought that maybe Samuel, because he has his hand up, has something to go along with that.
Yeah, I would like to pursue something to extend what Alex has said, but also address something, the way that I'm reading the example here. It kind of is written in a way that it suggests that the copies are separate beings. They are not extensions of Adam. They are 10 different people. Like Alex said, it would depend on the people. So I think we should perhaps start by saying that that's exactly what we mean, is that when you do create these emulations, they are not 10 extensions, but they are other people or other sentient beings in this context. And then it becomes a question of what their preferences are. But if it is the same person, and presumably Adam is working at the startup, then he has consented to have other parts of himself, which are the emulations, to also do so. That's my kind of interpretation, but I'm opening it up to see what other people think.
Thank you. By the way, I put my thumb up not to favor one person's opinion over another, but just because I was enthused to see the systematic desire to go back a step and look again at the example and then kind of figure out where we're going with that. Because so this example does make some assumptions, and you're right. It seems to say, yes, if you're making a whole brain emulation, you're emulating someone completely, someone's brain, someone's mind completely. and then that runs, then that is its own person. There was nothing in the example that said that there was some way to link them back to the person where the emulation was made. So you can't really say it's a part of that person, sort of in that connected sense or something. So yeah, that's one of the things that's in here. It's kind of, you make mind uploads, and then these are individual, conscious, sentient entities. And so then there's this question, even if you as a person decided, yeah, I want to go do this fast, so I want 10 copies to help me do this, and you consented yourself to do that, once you've created these sentient beings, if we at least agree that they are, or if we agree that they can be, or that they should have rights and all that sort of thing, that raises all kinds of questions. Yeah.
But is it okay if I respond?
Absolutely.
I kind of meant it, you said like they're individual copies. They're all individual, distinct things. They're not part of one larger atom. When I'm reading this, when I first read it kind of paralleled to me how people create digital profiles now. And these digital profiles for different social apps or maybe for a game. And then, they don't play the game, but the game does something while they're not there. And their digital self that is playing the game continues to do something in the game. We kind of have small copies of Adam, if this is the scenario we call it, already running now. And they are, this is the way I'm looking at it, is that they are these extensions of me. They're just digital, and they might be somewhat altered because I designed them to be altered. They're not exact copies. But I guess what you're saying is that this is written as an example to kind of more force us into the direction that these are separate.
No, it doesn't force us. It's just, it comes from that. You can see in the way it's written that it comes from that direction. But yours is an interesting example. I wonder what other people think about this idea of whether they are individuals, whether they're not small atoms. I don't know what that means exactly, but what Sam proposed. Farin.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is a really interesting example. I did have some questions about it, though. So the 10 atoms, are they deciding to do all this sort of digital labor on their own? Are they sort of programmed to do it, but they could break out? How much sort of degrees of freedom do these sort of emulation atoms have, right? Because depending on how we answer that question is going to, I think, at least for me, give me some feedback on how separate these are from Adam himself.
Okay, so I believe that the way this was written assumes that the 10 digital copies are complete copies. So the mind has all of the abilities of the original mind. So if the original mind has what we might call free will, then the digital copies have that as well. There's also a question of what can you do to constrain. So when you say what are the, I don't know exactly how you put it. I forgot the precise terminology, but you were talking about some limitations on what they could do. And there are the physical limitations potentially, or other limitations of how the upload was made and where they are, how they could actually choose to live. But besides that, I'm not sure exactly what we mean by those limitations. Go ahead.
Just to follow up really quickly. So these digital copies of Adam could, for example, just say, I don't want to do this manual labor. Right? This sounds awful. I'm just not. Right? Are we imagining this is the kind of scenario, or are we imagining sort of an Adam-like entity that would sort of have the same kind of responses to the stresses that are raised and would sort of process the information in the same way that Adam would, but nevertheless is sort of hard set on the task? I mean, the way it almost sounds like if they're going to be complete 100% emulations on their own, then all of them could just like unionize, right? Like they'd say, like, no, I don't want to do this. Is that the because I mean, again, if that is possible, that just so many new layers are now added in here and complicates the picture so much more. And yeah, I just didn't know how we're supposed to be thinking about it. But yeah.
I completely agree. It's multi-layered and complicated. Yeah. because yeah, when I read it just straight off the top, then it seems to me like these are basically 11 people in total if you count original Adam, and they could unionize. Marinda.
Yeah, I think I wrote it that they were going to be their own sentient moral agents, their own beings. So, and I guess if you were to sort of think about it, so if I was to make 10 copies of my mind, presumably they would also have the same goals that I would have. Like all 10 of them would also have this huge goal to build this startup. But I think Adam commits to unethical acts here by, number one, forcing them to work at a startup without first asking them if they want to, because they, as their own sentient beings, they have the free will to go do whatever they want. They don't really have to work at a startup. But given the fact that they are Adam, the second after they're uploaded, that they probably would have the same desire to work at the startup, but that doesn't mean that they can be forced to work at the startup if they chose not to at some point. And then also, I think it would be unethical just to offload the data and then kill them, because they're people now and they possess personhood, and with that comes legal rights. So I think those are two issues in the scenario. So I don't think you can just make 10 copies of yourself and then use them however you want and then kill them. That would be...
I think Jesse's hand went up first and then Alex. So Jesse?
Are these copies obligated to commitments that Adam made before he copied himself?
Well, I think that's exactly what we're discussing, right? Whether they're committed to that or not. Because I don't think that this is a given. I see that there are a lot of hands going up. We actually just reached our 15-minute limit, so we have another 5 minutes as things are going now before we have to switch. So we'll just keep it going for a while. Alex.
Yes. So I was saying, to me, it doesn't seem wise to make another 10 copies, because if those 10 copies continue to live, I wouldn't want to kill them. I would refuse to kill them. So how do they support themselves? Meaning, 10 copies need to have 1/10 of the original Adam of his bank account, so they have 1/10 of his property. Each one of the copies should have part of that. It makes it so complicated. I just don't think it's a wise idea.
Interesting. So now we have a vote for maybe we shouldn't even allow copies. That's interesting. I think Bryce is next.
Just in regard to Jesse's question, it's just my intuition that they wouldn't be or shouldn't be obligated to Adam's prior commitments, just because if they have subjective experience, then they should be regarded as subjects in their own right, and so I think for that reason they shouldn't be obligated to Adam's prior commitments.
Okay, and Minda.
Yeah, I feel like a interesting piece here that feels like a missing piece is like, what is the environment that these copies live in? Because, I think it was Alex that brought this up, but, do they have, do they have access to resources and assets, and what does that mean in the digital world? And it's also hard, to separate an agent from its environment in some respects. So it feels like it adds a number of extra constraints. So my question is, what is the environment that it lives in?
That's a great question. And I think that where this is all coalescing to is it, so as an ethical question, it's not just a question, can you make them work, but are you even allowed to create them like this? What kind of environment do you have to create them into? Like, is it unethical to create a conscious mind into an environment where they're basically trapped and can only do one thing or something like that?
Yeah.
So it goes in that direction. This is raising some serious questions about copies. Okay. We still have a little bit of time if we want. continue on this topic? Maybe we can try to, I tried to summarize it a little bit here, but I may have forgotten something important in the summary. Not that it's a big problem. We have our auditor recording everything and we'll get a transcript afterwards.
You do really great summaries, Randall.
Thank you. All right. If we are basically done with this, I see Farhan has a hand up. Sorry, didn't see you there.
No, you're all good. I was just going to sort of jump in and what was just said, depending on the environment, is also going to have sort of ramifications for the conscious life of this creature, arguably, right? Depending on your view of consciousness. But if it is in a kind of trapped, as you sort of said, it's unclear whether it would have the kind of robust conscious states that would allow for being a kind of perfect copy. So it sounds like we almost, if we're going to create these and we want them to be perfect copies of Adam, we're also going to have to almost digitally recreate a space that Adam would be in so that we can get Adam's normal, natural responses to provoke Adam's certain thoughts. And then, I think how we answer that last question is just going to have huge ramifications on even whether it can even be a quote-unquote sort of perfect copy of Adam. But that's all.
I really love where this went because this is really meaningful. This kind of, it's to me, this sounds very similar to arguments that you hear about, say, for example, ethics in research, where how do you treat lab animals? What kind of an environment do they have to live in? And I'm not saying that these are animals, they're people maybe because, they're entire atoms, but it's similar to that question because you can't just stick a rat in a tiny, tiny cage and say, well, that's all they need and, no stimulation of any other kind, and then it's fine. So very interesting. All right. And I think we're right on time to switch to the next topic.
Okay, so just go ahead and read it.
Go ahead.
Okay. So data security and privacy. Once uploaded into a digital format, individuals' consciousnesses could be subject to surveillance, monitoring, or control by external entities. This raises concerns about privacy invasion, manipulation, and the potential for individuals to be coerced or influenced without their consent. Governments, large corporations, or malicious actors could exploit digital consciousnesses for various purposes, including behavioral manipulation or intelligence gathering. Corporations could abuse our mental privacy by hacking into the computers, hosting our emulations, and using our mental data for corporate gain. Moreover, without reliable security measures, unauthorized alterations or manipulations could occur within an upload's digital consciousness, resulting in individuals losing trust in the integrity of their own mind and experiences. That means like implanting false memories or something like that. This could cause psychological turmoil for the emulation, not knowing which reality is the correct one. Are my thoughts and choices in my digital consciousness truly my own, or were they implanted by some nefarious hacker? Weak security measures would also undermine the foundations of the justice system, which relies on personal accounts of events and personal autonomy. For example, in criminal law, mens rea refers to the mental state or intention behind committing a crime, roughly translating to guilty mind or guilty intent. Without reliable security measures, establishing mens rea in a criminal case would become virtually impossible, since the bad actor could artificially implant malicious or criminal intent into the digital mind, unbeknownst to that emulation. How will we protect the privacy and security of our digital minds?
Thank you. All right. Anyone have thoughts? Alex.
Yes. So that's the kind of problem I'm afraid of, because knowing that mind has been uploaded like something cool and interesting, there's different kinds of security problems there that make me a little trepidatious. So I don't know if there's a matter of securing development or finding another way to identify it, to block that kind of nefarious uploading, those kinds of thoughts. How do we prevent that from happening in the first place?
Can I ask, what do you mean by nefarious uploading? Do you mean that someone is being uploaded without their consent? Or do you mean that the upload is not properly secured? It's kind of a, sort of
what I mean is deciding if that person, the person who decides to do the upload, maybe they've got something in mind as a way to manipulate, for manipulation purposes without uploading the mind, without the person being uploaded being aware of it.
Oh, okay. So kind of like we'll give everybody free email, but then we'll use data that we kind of get from that for advertising and things like that.
Yes, exactly. Perfect. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah, this is that gets pretty close to a lot of the things I was thinking about as I was looking at this, because you think at first maybe that this is a pretty simple one, just use good data security protocols, encrypt everything. But then it's not as easy as that, because first of all, where does the encryption start? Like, let's say you've got a device that is making a recording, let's say the electron microscope images you're making, or the electrode recordings, or whatever you're making. Does it start right there at the tip of the electrode in the analog recordings that you have the security measures put in there? Is there some way for somebody to tap in there? Or how are those data, how's that all handled? So it gets tricky. It gets to be kind of like handling, medical data that has to be handled very carefully, or government security data like, national security. But then there's that flip side where, depending on how this whole process is set up, let's say it's very expensive to make uploads. And so it's something that's left to large corporations to figure out how to be able to afford to do that by offering services or offering something. And then the ones who try to make their services a bit cheaper, they request that you sign that it's okay to use some data for some purposes or whatever. And other things like that, because how often do we just, click yes, yes, yes on all the, the large statements that they're giving us on their privacy and whatever other things. So we just kind of give it all away. That was some of the first thoughts that came to my mind. Bryce.
Yeah, I guess a question about this. Are we thinking that when the mind is uploaded, that, like, it becomes conscious in this process of the upload? And is that sort of an additional issue here? Because like your mind could be uploaded and stolen without your knowledge, and then I guess, does that give someone access to your mind, or is the issue that now there's sort of a separate person, like kind of the previous problem? It's a little unclear.
Right. Good. Yeah, that's definitely a good point. So this is just discussing data. So it discusses, say, the data that is used to create a working whole brain emulation, a working upload. So that could be any data like that, just like you have DNA data that you have to also decide whether you're going to keep that secure or not. But you're right. I mean, there's also the question of data security in a running upload, a mind that is working sort of like our minds right now. I think that data security for our thoughts in our biological brain is also a valid question. But yeah, this means really any data security. So all of the data that has something to do with our minds right now is largely our own, unless someone kind of prods and pulls it out of us by, I don't know, interrogation or whatever, or having us do quizzes online. But yeah, in the future, maybe there are other ways to get at all of that data, whether it's data in the running mind or data from the original biological brain that was used to create the mind, either types of data. I think Richard was first.
Yeah. Well, it's good because I wanted to bring in how Samuel thought about it in the last one, because he was like analogizing it to the like what we have currently, like when you're going or when you're on Google, like there's some level of data protection there, right? And like you're gonna or it's gonna be stored somewhere, and we're gonna have some sort of, I guess, mechanism where this mind upload is gonna be stored somewhere, and we're gonna build monitoring systems around that mind upload thing. So, yeah, I guess similar questions arise from like the like when 9/11 happened, and like the U.S. was able to monitor more of the internet traffic, and so yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say.
Interesting. I was wondering what you meant by, the monitoring is put in place around the mind upload. I was wondering if you meant monitoring just to check, is the mind uploading working well, which is a question. I mean, you probably want to monitor the health of the mind upload, so then you have to have access to some of the data, and that's tricky. But yeah, so you're talking more about whether, say, for example, government will require or request access to some data because, say, for example, they want to find out if there's going to be some unrest or whatever, something like that. Is that one of the things you were wondering about?
Yeah, I guess it's like, I guess however we handled it now or are currently still handling it is probably going to be analogous to this, what we're talking about.
I see. Kind of take those.
So digital versus biological.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay. I think Samuel is up.
I actually want to go down that path. Randall's first interpretation, I guess, of Richard's comments there about, I guess, monitoring the health of the mind, because like it's really difficult, as Randall said earlier, for us to prevent nefarious actions towards any digital object, let alone a whole brain emulated brain. But if I was to extend this to kind of like maintaining integrity, I think, there are we can design tests that would say monitor the functioning of the emulation. Or maybe that should be a question. Can we design a test that measures the integrity of the emulation? Because just like a nefarious hacker, some other events may cause corruptions. And kind of my line of thinking here is all about how can we ensure that when this event happens, there are not going to be ramifications that are highly detrimental. So I'm going towards two directions. One is, okay, are there tests that we can design that take into account that, yes, the brain is changing over time, and so does the mind, so does the emulation, but we can measure what is healthy and what is corrupt functioning. And then secondly is it also possible to store backups over some period of time that you can then go back to, extending what Richard said about how people handle data breaches now, and when systems go down, they, reboot an earlier version of the database. Is that an acceptable proposition from an ethical standpoint to reboot somebody from an earlier emulation if we spot that it has been compromised? These are larger questions, but I'm just trying to kind of get more practical around the measures we can put in from software development perspective.
Yeah, these are great questions. For a second there, in my mind, when we were talking about monitoring and, trust in monitoring and stuff, my mind went back to the previous question. What if we made a second copy of ourselves? Do we trust ourselves to monitor ourselves? But, that was just going totally away from anything we really need to discuss. But yeah, you made some really good points. So one of the things is that this monitoring to see is activity in the brain going away from what is acceptable or from what is normal or from what is healthy. You definitely need to have that. In fact, you even need to have that just in the original process of creating the whole brain emulation, because you need to be able to validate whether this is actually a healthy brain that you created. So those types of functions will have to exist, and that is a kind of monitoring of the data that's there. I suspect that there's a way to do that where it's happening at a fairly granular level, and so you can keep that down where everything is within, say, the security box. Not 100% sure about that. But yeah, that's definitely an important concern. There was another part. What was the second part, Samuel? You had so many ideas there. There was something that I wanted to quickly touch on. What came after that?
Maybe backups.
Yes, the backups. Right. I'd say, of course, you want to have backups. That's one of the reasons that one would want to have a technology like this in the first place. In fact, the first upload you make is kind of a backup, right? Every time you pull data out of a brain and you store it somewhere, that's a backup. So you want to have that, but it does raise all kinds of questions. Say, for example, if you have had a bunch of other thoughts and your brain has further developed and evolved and your synapses are now different, but then something happens and say you've had maybe a day go by and then you say, well, let's revert back to the previous backup because something went wrong. That's also interesting from an ethical point of view, because you could say that these are two different people. And can you just wipe out this new person that has developed over a day in order to go back to the previous state? It's kind of similar to questions like, well, if you give somebody a drug so that you can interrogate them, but then that drug makes sure that they forget about the whole interrogation experience a day later, is that ethical? Stuff like that, right? That we can imagine happening now in our biological bodies, but the same sort of thing would apply with backups. Very tricky. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this? Yes, Deb.
So my point is, under the assumption that we can assume that each of these, I'll call them digital replicas, they are their own person. And is it worthwhile to consider having each of these digital replicas have the ability to detect whether they are being manipulated or not, in the sense that whether they can distinguish whether the reality they are being fed is different than what is actually real.
So something like whether they can tell if the data that is appearing, say, after, I don't know, the next 100 milliseconds in their mind, if that comes from the existing processes in their mind, so from other propagated activity versus, say, something from the outside that is being impressed on it?
Exactly.
Something like that? Yeah, that's the sort of thing you'd probably want to set up. I'm sure that gets into, then you're going to have a whole arms race of that kind of neural security, let's just say, neural data security measures, and people trying to break that and make inobtrusive, unnoticeable ways of overcoming that. That'll be interesting. But yeah, that's a really practical, technical question there. Yeah. Farhan.
Yeah, no, that last bit you just said there reminds me of sort of what we kind of experience now. I mean, this is kind of what marketers do, right? They're kind of trying to find a way to worm their way into your mind to manipulate your behavior in a way that you don't really notice. But we don't, I mean, for the most part, I mean, people sort of get up in arms a little bit about it, but people seem to be okay with that, roughly speaking, the way ads are placed and how persuasive ads can be. And you don't even know that you're having these desires are sort of just bubbling up in your system until you go to the gas station. You go, yeah, I do want that drink. Why do I want that drink? I don't know why. I know now I want that drink. So I kind of wonder if we're going to have very similar conversations to sort of what we have now with marketing, and whether there's going to be sort of ways in which, sure, that digital emulation can be marketed to a little bit, but we got to figure out where we draw that line between sort of marketing to it and subtly changing its code and figuring out ways to sort of change its code and sort of invasively doing that. Where that line is drawn is just going to be super hard, I think, to figure out. But I think that would be a place to kind of press the discussion a little bit further.
Mm-hmm. Very good point about the similarity with current marketing methods. Mirinda.
Yeah, this just reminded me, I think this is actually a really old philosophical problem. It's reminding me of Descartes when he wrote about the evil genius or the evil demon in the Meditations, implanting some fake reality into his brain, and he was trying to, understand the true nature of reality and how do we get to that and how can we distinguish any potentially false sensations implanted in our minds by an evil god or an evil demon. So I guess if we can build a good firewall, we can solve Descartes' problem.
Well said. I'm reminded of how advertisers have learned how to try to make their advertising seem more and more like what we encounter in the real world so that you don't know that you're being manipulated. Say, for example, when they make articles that are supposed to appear like regular news articles, but it's really an advertisement, and you only know that if you look at the tiny, tiny little bit at the bottom that says it's actually an advertisement. That sort of thing, but then in this other area, say where the virtual world is manipulated that you're living in, or the real world is manipulated just like you do now, all of that sort of stuff is going to stay. But then, of course, there are additional concerns because there are additional ways to directly get at the data in the brain. Yeah. We are, by the way, already over our 15 minutes. We have another 3.5 minutes left of that extra time that we have in between topics. So if there are still thoughts, this would be a great time to mention them. If not, then we can, of course, move on to the next topic already. Give us a little extra time there. Let's do that. Oh, wait, Sam. One last one. Okay.
Yeah, I keep thinking, and I think it ties maybe these two topics, consent and data security together. I keep thinking about what is the consent that the living biological atom, if we extend him to this example here too, would have to comply with or agree to before the emulation occurs. Because you could say that, hey, there are some problems. We haven't worked out how to prevent security breaches in the future. So you can choose between what kind of emulations you're going to be experiencing or environments in the future. And you can be completely isolated from the internet, living, on your local server. And that's going to be more secure. Or you can not do that, but then you're opening up, yourself to influences, or you can set the kind of Farhan said, you can set the kind of level at which you're allowing the world to influence you, as if we're allowing that marketing campaigns to do that for us to some extent. Some people might not. Some people opt out of marketing communications. So to me, it feels like, at least at the beginning, this needs to be a long, long list of scenarios. And then my kind of personal biases here are towards individual's choice. So your individual choice then is to choose what, you consent to out of all these scenarios. And that's maybe the only way to.
I really like this. This proposal that you look at it as a series of different options of, say, trade-offs between security and I don't know, I guess other things that you get. And the first sort of instinct is to go, oh yeah, as liberal as possible. Everybody gets to choose whatever they want to. And then I start thinking, but then there are ramifications to that, because it could be that, say, those who give up the most of their liberty have the greatest capabilities because of whatever they're getting back for that, and then they have an advantage in society over those who don't. So do they now have to be kept in completely different worlds or something so that doesn't have an effect? Or it just gets more complicated, but that's normal. We're just seeing that there's a whole tree of possibilities here. It's sort of like questions like, yeah, you have the freedom to choose a lot of things, but for example, you can't choose to sell yourself into slavery. Why is that? So things like that, those kind of questions come up. We have 1 more minute before we have to switch to another topic, so this does give Richard a bit of time.
Oh, cool. Okay. I guess there isn't, or what is it? There's also the question of, who would even try to fund the initial security practices of uploading mines. I feel like people are just wanting to move as quickly as possible to getting to that mined upload. And so like, like way back, cybersecurity people, they didn't have any jobs. And then all of a sudden, a lot of people got data leaks, and they're like, wait, we need cybersecurity. And now cybersecurity people in the current times are getting paid a lot of money. And so that's also like a question, is the funding of these potential risks. No one wants to pay for these risk preventions until something bad happens.
It's beginning to sound.
There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so whole brain emulation technology has the potential to provide financial and social advantages to those who have access to it, potentially exacerbating existing socioeconomic inequalities. Emulations have the capacity for rapid learning, data collection and processing, and enhanced problem-solving abilities, potentially surpassing the cognitive abilities and resources of non-emulated individuals. Developing countries may struggle to afford or implement whole brain emulation technology, further widening the gap between the developed and developing world and exacerbating global inequalities. If only the wealthiest members of society can afford to have their minds uploaded, what measures will be taken to counteract and prevent potential socioeconomic advantages for the wealthy and ensure that lower and middle classes are not left behind?
Thank you. And I can already see how this connects to all of our previous topics. By the way, as we go and as you're thinking about things to add to this, just wanted to mention that if you have questions or issues with the format of this, the fact that we're going through all these topics with a very limited amount of time or something like that, we're really open to hearing about that afterwards. We're testing it this time around, obviously. So far, I'm finding it quite enjoyable. Okay, anybody have anything to contribute here? Yes, Richard.
I guess I can like continue like with the funding point, is that like not a lot of people want to really think about the people that are not as wealthy, or what is it? Maybe my thoughts are a bit jumbled here, but like we don't want to think about things that aren't as like nice to think about. Maybe I don't know. I'm getting scrambled here.
Right. So your point is that we're initially going to focus on just getting to the technology as quickly as possible, and whatever is going to make it possible to do that, to have us afford that, is going to be the path that you take.
Yes.
And then everything else comes afterwards, which again sounds a lot like one of the questions in AI.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
So I agree. That's a real reason to have these concerns. Yeah. Samuel.
I'm sorry, I always have seemed to have introduced like more directions rather than giving people closure. Here's another one. I wanted to know what people think about who actually these first people with access to whole brain emulation are. Who are these first demographic? What do you think? Because I think that influences this question a lot.
Yeah, you're right. This is exactly what this question is about. And the question seems to be saying that there will be some who have it earlier than others, and those some are going to be the ones with more capital, which will probably be from either wealthier countries or wealthy individuals or something like that. So, for example, this is not assuming that there's, say, a world government and this is all being paid for by Medicare that everybody has for free or something like that. Yeah. Jesse.
There's obviously no way to know what it's going to take in terms of resources. What, if it's going to be something that's, only the top 0.1% are able to afford, or the top, 70% are able to afford. But if it were possible, would it make sense for it to be treated as funerary? We'll get a life insurance policy, and that covers, you can choose to get a life insurance policy that is intended to cover the cost of uploading. That uploading would be performed, when you die or when you're on the verge of dying. Is that an approach that might somewhat mitigate inequity?
Yeah, so the approach of having a life insurance policy pay for the procedure, which, by the way, is a separate question from who affords to develop all of this. This is kind of then how do you pay for the procedure, but you could say you're paying for the development after the fact, so maybe it is the same thing. Anyway, that approach sounds familiar. For example, that's the approach that Alcor takes for cryonics. You use life insurance to pay for your suspension. I think that has some merit, but when I hear that, the question that comes up in my mind is, first of all, how much do these life insurance policies cost? Is this something that everybody has access to? And if they don't, and you have, say, some kind of philanthropic effort to pay the life insurance policies of people who don't have enough capital on their own, so they also have access, I guess that's a way you could deal with that. Then there's still the question of who is well enough informed about the pros and cons of all of this to then go ahead and deal with getting a life insurance policy and all of that. So I know I'm just throwing more complications in there that are really petty. It's like almost bureaucratic complications. But I think that this kind of all gets into the same category where this question is, which is really about inequities. And inequities come in all sorts of forms. They come in forms of capital, they come in forms of knowledge, and in many other ways. I think, just adding to this briefly, the main part of this question is that you have a potential inequity accelerator here, because you could have that people who already have more or access to more than others would have an accelerated potential, leaving others behind, and that gap would become faster, much larger in this manner, rather than technology being something that makes the playing field more level, which is perhaps what we would prefer. So, how could you have that instead of the other? Farhan.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the question one more time, and I'm making sure that I'm on the right sort of page. Is the question what actions will be taken as written? So what actions will in fact be taken to counteract the measures, or what actions should we take to sort of counteract the measures? Because there are ways we can, if it's the latter, if it's what should be taken, we can imagine things like taxes that are put on companies that are just experiencing rapid growth, and we use those taxes to fund other countries, sort of allowing them to get to the same sort of level. Right? There are steps that can be taken. Whether that will happen, I'm not as confident in the given world we're in, just because it's not an ethical place a lot of the time. So are we sort of brainstorming sort of policies that we might put forward that we could sort of pitch to companies, or just I'm just trying to make sure I'm on the right sort of page here.
I think that we could be thinking about that, yeah. So we don't just have to look at what will likely happen. We could look at what should happen, because the whole point ultimately is to use this information to try to create an ethical framework. So I think, we'd like to go in both directions. Bryce.
Just to kind of echo Farhan's point a little bit. I tend to be more skeptical with regards to the kind of regulatory solutions that are on the table. Looking back at how technology has been rolled out, I just tend to be skeptical about those kinds of solutions. So when you have a potentially really groundbreaking technology like mind uploading, I feel like looking back at the history of these sort of regulatory attempts and thinking if they didn't work so well with less impactful technologies, what's going to happen with this scale of tech? Are the like you say, it's accelerating. It could potentially make things not only worse, but sort of much, much worse. So I just tend to be skeptical about, I guess, regulatory solutions.
And I think the skepticism is a good thing to have. I mean, I wasn't going to mention, say, the most extreme scenario, but you could imagine a scenario where, say, whole brain emulation very rapidly allows for such an increase in capabilities by, for example, just running your mind 1,000 times faster, that whoever gets it first immediately has an enormous advantage over anyone else, so that it almost becomes like these scenarios that get talked about in AI, where you have the one big AI that is just the AI that takes over. I'm not sure if that's a likely scenario here, so I wasn't going there. But yeah, this is definitely something to consider. Farhan.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a way to, if we're thinking about policies that we should enact, which would be good to enact, and then we're trying to also, link that with a realistic understanding of the world. I wonder if there's a way to sort of brainstorm policies where we might come up with arguments that say, hey, look, it's going to help not just you out, right? A successful company, United States. It's going to help everybody out, and it'll help you more when everybody has this technology. So maybe there's this scenario argument we could put forward of, hey, if we do allow this technology to spread, and if we do promote this technology around the world, it might lead to such a great increases in efficiency that the United States would just get, the companies in the United States would get even richer than they were when they were the only kids playing in the playground. Maybe we bring all the kids into the playground, the economic playground. Maybe there's some kind of policy that we could, or some kind of argument we could think of, where we essentially make it to the benefit of rich corporations in the United States to give other countries this technology. Maybe that might be a way of kind of trying to do both at the same time. So we help out other countries and don't leave them behind, but we also recognize we're in a realistic scenario where companies act in their own benefit. So if there's a way to do that, that might be a kind of middle ground. Yeah, I don't know. This is the thought.
That's an interesting proposal. That's almost like saying if you have, say, an association of, research centers working on this, then if all the governments there decide it's best to have an equal level playing field, that companies would receive, say, support, some kind of kind of like you do for electric car companies or something. You give them money for something. So in this case, maybe for having a center that is also operating in another country in Africa or something like that. I could see that there would possibly be a lot of things that you could do there. It would be really wonderful if there was something really intrinsic, like a really natural intrinsic thing that makes those who want to develop the technology want to make it available to everyone. So for example, if it turns out that everyone's mind is in some way uniquely, incredibly valuable and important, has beautiful algorithms in it that are going to help the world in some way, and then therefore you would want to make this available to all 8 billion. I'm not saying that there is, but it would be wonderful if that were the case. Farhan.
Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking about, even if we just step away from the financial side and we're just thinking about a kind of digital universe that people are sort of occupying, I almost wonder whether those who are really rich would just feel really empty in that universe without more people in it, right? I wonder if there's a kind of natural way of spinning where you go, look, if it's just you, if it's just Zuckerberg and Musk, right? It's just y'all two in there all day. Isn't that going to be really boring? Don't we want isn't what makes life really interesting when we have these rich kind of interactions and environments? Shouldn't we do it? I think there's a way of sort of making that argument where it actually just isn't as interesting if it's just in the hands of a few, and what makes life rich is what's going to make the digital universe rich. And there's maybe a way to kind of push it in that direction. So.
Very interesting. Although that Zuckerberg-Musk thing does make me think that we might finally get a cage match or something like that. So that possibility is out there. But yeah, so a rich universe. It's making me feel like what we're actually trending towards, this of course applies to everything, and applies to access to education and access to all sorts of things that we wish everybody had. We wish there was a level playing field all over the world. So it's trending towards this. We should all recognize the importance of the richness of the future we build, and so we should create a socioeconomic political system where that is something that is valued more than, say, capital and all the wonderful things that come from that. So, yeah, this is a bigger problem than I think just mind uploading, but it's interesting how it applies here. Samuel.
I want to continue with these speculative options that perhaps people may have access to. When, if the access to a whole brain emulation is limited by the amount of brains that you can emulate at a particular time, maybe another technology that they might consent to is to have their brain preserved for a later time. As okay, this is going to cost less, this is more available, and it means that I can upload myself later on. If it is that the prohibitive factor here for your upload is the computing power, maybe some people would opt in to have
down, make it available by preserving the brain so that you can do it later.
Yeah, so if people are okay with that, having a few thousand years in between when they die and when they reawaken, if we're following that argument or we're siding with that argument, then that's an option. And maybe another option is that they are if the problem is the cost of the running of the emulation, of computing the emulation, perhaps they can opt in to have their brain also combined with other brains that have been scanned and then run in the same environment or the same simulation, if we can think about it that way, and merge with a larger number of people. So I want to say that there might be some other but even more speculative options how we can solve access.
Interesting. Yeah, so the one about running on some giant server together with many other people or something, that's I'm not going to touch that right now, but the question of, say, preserving brains to upload them later, what comes to mind is, again, inequity, because we're looking at here the question of, okay, what's it like if only some people get to upload and have the advantages, if we assume there are advantages, over others? Say, what about the inequality or inequity of having to wait 1,000 years? Like, say that everyone in Africa waits for 1,000 years before they get to join the rest of the world in this new world where uploading is normal and everything's running 10,000 times as fast and whatnot. So how much have they missed and how far out of sync are they? It does seem like a bit of an inequality again, like a disadvantage in a sense. So yes, it's better than not at all, but it's still a huge disadvantage. So I'm not sure this solves everything, but it's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay, research and development with animals. Researchers learn how to carry out human whole brain emulation and uploading by testing methods with various animals, such as rats or non-human primates. What must researchers do to prevent suffering of not just the biological animals, but also the suffering of the uploaded animals? What must be done with unsuccessful animal uploads? And how about the successful ones?
Yeah, so this is not humans, this is animals, but animals can also suffer. And you can imagine that, say, when you first start experimenting, not every upload is going to be a successful one. Some of them may be suffering seizures every minute or so, or other problems. What do you do then? And then the question is, if you have uploaded, say, 10 rats and a few fruit flies and a number of non-human primates on your way there, and they are successful uploads, do you now have to keep them around forever because they are conscious animals? Or what are the rules that apply there? Bryce?
Yeah, this is probably a little bit of my first point, but and it's a little bit more optimistic. So I'm imagining that if we get so good at uploading that we presumably can have models of animals, models of their brain, that aren't going to be conscious, because we've gotten so good at modeling this. Maybe we know how, again, to kind of not include that part there, and then we're studying animals that aren't suffering because they're sort of, it's just the model in this case, which I guess would be, according to you, like a simulation, not an emulation. But I guess that's the point, is if you get so good at emulation, maybe you're also getting quite good at simulation, because you're now aware of what the difference is. You've gotten so good at actually being capable of building the emulation. So if you're so good at that, maybe your abilities at simulation become so good that you can just simulate rather than emulate. It's probably the way to say it. The animals, you can test on them in a way that doesn't involve the suffering. And then if they are in fact conscious and the emulations are suffering, then in that case I would say we have the same problem sort of recreated.
Richard.
So I guess upload them, but like in a suspended state, so that they're not conscious. Maybe I'm not sure if that's like tracking with Bryce.
Yeah, I like what you brought up there, Richard, because this of course ties right into what Bryce was saying, and I was going to ask, because of course one of the things you're going to want to do to get uploading to work is that you're going to want to be able to test that you can actually create a mind that works and is conscious. So you'll have to try it at least once, probably many times, because things never work the first time. Never, ever. They won't work 10,000 times in a row, probably. So you may end up with all sorts of somewhat conscious things that have all kinds of problems. Maybe not. Maybe there's a way to avoid it. That would be really great to figure that out. I do think that it's true that you could, once you have created really sophisticated emulations, and you don't necessarily run them. When you created a very sophisticated model before running it, before it being a working emulation, you could carve out a piece and say, okay, if I am only using like the orbitofrontal cortex, probably that's not going to be a fully conscious animal if I'm just going to do a test there. So I could run all kinds of experiments with that. And then in that case, doing this could even be a way to make current neuroscience more humane in a sense that we're treating animals better. We don't have to have lab rats anymore. So that's great. But there is that question of, well, what are you doing as you're actually trying to get towards uploading? You know, at one point you could say, well, then we have to switch to human volunteers because they're the only ones who can really understand what's going on and consent. So these have to be patients. Yeah, we could talk about that as well. Does this break the leg off a chair? Is the leg still a chair? That's a good point. Yeah. I do see there's some chat going on that I haven't really been looking at.
Chat was talking about the previous question of who gets access to whole brain emulation first.
So that's what your comment was about it not being the Lords that receive the cancer treatment.
I suppose, but connected with this topic, I think it's similar because it talks about how the first users of any technology or any experimental technology of this kind are clinical trial participants, and even before that, it's going to be the animals. How these first beings that get uploaded. You mentioned this with AI. There might be a scenario that they, significantly outpace any follow-on uploads, and that perhaps on the positive side solve a lot of the issues. So the inequity, it starts with here. Who are the R&D animals that are going to be participating, and then who are the first participants? Are they going to be the super wealthy people, or are they going to test it on somebody else?
Does this become a long-termist utilitarian kind of question? Something like, how much future suffering can you prevent by carrying out a little bit of suffering right now, and who's going to be doing the suffering? Something of that nature?
There's a threshold for that even today with clinical trials. It's just, where do we set the threshold?
Richard.
I'm not sure if this is relevant, but if you guys know this Brian Johnson character, he's like he's not extending, or he's not uploading his mind, but he's trying to extend his life as much as humanly possible. and he's succumbing himself to like all of these experiments and drugs and treatment and exercise routine and whatever. And I'm not sure if it's relevant, but like he's kind of becoming this lab rat, and like he's
Right. So we're talking here about a very wealthy individual who made himself the guinea pig.
Yes.
With a lot of understanding of what it means. So very much with informed consent, and is subjecting himself only to as much of that treatment as he chooses to receive in an ongoing way. Or he's not like obligated to receive the whole thing all the way through. It's not like he's living in a cage. So that is a bit different, I think. But it's an interesting one because maybe we should be doing all of our research for whole brain emulation only on such individuals. Is that an option?
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, I do understand that there are now over 1,000 billionaires in the US, so we probably have a long list of guinea pigs. Farhan.
I'm almost wondering whether this case provides us with sort of more obligations for how we ought to treat animals. Because we can sort of imagine after we have uploaded an animal, a non-human primate or a rat, and then we've done all our testing, and we're done with all of our testing, if we have the capacity to do so, which we arguably will, to create these virtual environments to where they can engage with other virtual animals, and it's something that maybe we can't do in the biological world. It seems like if you're just sort of approaching this from a utilitarian perspective, we might have sort of a further obligation, given that, once we make it once on one server somewhere, we can just copy and paste. And so it sounds like, arguably, I'm not a computer scientist, I imagine that's how it works. We can just sort of copy and paste. So arguably, if we can provide them with all these amenities, even when we're using them for testing, if it's much easier to do so, much more capable of doing so, we might have greater obligation to these virtual animals than we might have for real animals. I think it could be a sort of interesting scenario.
I suspect that is a relevant question. That's kind of how the question was also posed here for that reason. So I'm of the same mind that we may have more responsibilities. But then, of course, I ask myself other questions like, why do we have the responsibility to keep this lab rat alive now that it's in a virtual environment and keep it going forever when we kill animals to eat them? There's these sort of questions like, why is it okay to kill animals sometimes but not other times? So it gets complicated again, and I think Jesse has the answer for us.
Yes, complete answer. No, another question is, when does an uploaded animal die? Is it when the emulation stops running or when the data is deleted? Does that make sense?
Sorry, when does an uploaded animal die? When it stops running or when the data is deleted? That is a very, very good question that's going to apply to all of us, of course, whether animal or human. And Thomas is already responding with deleted, and I think that's probably what people would agree with in that case, because what's the difference between, say, stopping an emulation and pausing an emulation? And what does it matter whether the time step, the clock of the computer that's running it is, say, a nanosecond or an hour? So I would also tend to go to deletion. But yeah, I see where that's going. What's your next point then? Is it just store them not running?
Then the obligation is to store data, not to run. There isn't an obligation to continue running them.
I was just kidding when I said, and Jesse has the answer for us, but apparently you do. Any other thoughts? We still have a couple minutes on this one. Deb.
Perhaps, perhaps impose a cost on running an experiment on an animal's mind upload, if that makes sense. So the cost may be monetary, it's just a way of penalizing redundant animal mind upload experiments, because it's kind of trying to, at least that's what my thinking is, trying to solve the problem by eliminating the cause of it, because the way you would end up with unsuccessful animal uploads is probably by poorly planning the experiment. And in that case, if the cost of a poorly planned experiment is high, it might prevent you from, or it might incentivize you from planning your experiments in such a way that, so that's what my point is.
I think that you're right that poorly planning will lead to more unsuccessful uploads. So in that sense, I see the sort of incentive of making it not too easy, not too cheap, so that people will really take their time thinking about it carefully. But on the other hand, clearly there will be many unsuccessful attempts also, just because there are things we don't know, and experiments are often done exploratory way, not just in an engineering type of way. It's not like you're always trying to build a bridge and you know exactly what's up with the stresses. Sometimes you're exploring something you really don't understand. So there's that. And so this kind of sounds a little similar to, say, making lab rats as expensive as possible so that there are fewer neuroscience experiments with lab rats. So interesting corollary there. Farhan, we still have maybe 2-3 minutes of discussion after the alarm went off, so you can continue a little bit.
Yeah. No, I mean, so much of this just seems to turn on sort of what ethical theory we're going to be using. I mean, even if we are going to be sort of arguing, as we have been from a largely utilitarian perspective, even within utilitarianism, there's all the different varieties of utilitarianism that come up. And so, for example, on perhaps one variety of utilitarianism, even suspending might not be considered to be ethically permissible. I mean, it's going to be ethically impermissible. So I think, this is obviously the hardest question, but we're going to have to do, before we do any of this stuff, we're going to have to agree on some kind of ethical system to operate from, because otherwise our intuitions are just pulling from sort of, okay, well, yeah, we have intuitions on this side, okay, some sort of deontological intuitions, that's really interesting, and okay, now we got some over here, utilitarianism are really interesting. And for me, at least, when I'm thinking about all this stuff from a philosophical perspective, it's like, okay, let's choose a system, because then we're kind of all over the place. And I think that's going to be just sort of one of the. Do
you have a system you wish to propose?
No, I don't, because it's hard. No, I do ethics. I don't claim to have figured out all of ethics. I do lean utilitarian. But I also have some views of philosophy of mind where I'm not as sympathetic to others, and thinking that, the whole idea is just purely suffering based. Basically sort of purely pleasure or suffering is the two relevant sort of moral factors here. Those aren't the approaches that I find to be the most interesting, but I also know that my views are highly contentious, and so are everybody's. But if we're going to do a policy, we do want to sort of agree on some kind of groundwork, and that's where I keep getting caught up, is what groundwork we're going to use, something consistent.
Yeah, I agree that we do need to work our way towards a system. Right now we're just collecting ideas and information, obviously, but we can see where this is running into trouble, because I agree that, what seemed like an obvious, easy solution, just store the animal, don't run it. Yeah, but then if you apply the same logic to people, right, like they've uploaded, we just store them, we don't run them. It's a problem. It's obviously not the same thing as being a running upload, and running at what speed and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah. We have kind of run out of time, so I'm going to give Michael the last word on this topic. Michael Andrade?
Hey, everyone. I don't know if I have a smart enough comment to be the last word, but just hopefully we don't have to solve all of ethics, I guess, before getting this tech to work. Also, there's just a lot of moral uncertainty, too. I mean, use some utilitarian, some theological, etc. Also, why are animals quite so much different than people? Maybe they're just similar, but just a little little less or something. There's some kind of gradient. Yeah, I don't know. Those are just a couple of quick comments. Yeah, that's it.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah. Your comments have been noted. They're in the record. So let's move on. But yes, there are so many more things we can discuss here. And I do understand the sort of the fear of, oh my God, what if we have to solve all of these moral dilemmas before we can do something? That's just not doable. That's of course not how it works. But we are trying to kind of in parallel, concurrently, simultaneously try to wrap our heads around the ethical frameworks as they might be. But yeah, it's all very messy. Mirinda, you want to take us into the next topic? You're on mute again.
Okay, so digital consciousness and ownership. One of the primary legal issues surrounding whole brain emulation is the ownership of digital copies of an individual's consciousness. Who owns the digital emulation of a person's mind? Is it the individual themselves, the entity or organization that conducted the upload, or someone else entirely? Or perhaps the emulation is incapable of being owned in any sense due to the sentient quality of its mental existence. That is all, so this is a quote from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. This, of course, begs the question, are emulations human beings, and what defines a being as a human? Is it our biological nature or sentience or consciousness or some other trait? Clarifying ownership rights is essential to prevent disputes over control, access, and use of digital consciousnesses.
Thank you. And I'm sure everybody can see how this kind of overlaps with some of the previous topics we've already touched upon. But now it's specifically the question of when you make an upload, when you do data collection in order to create a whole brain emulation, and there is all of that data there, who actually owns this emulation that you create, this digital copy? Is it entirely the emulation itself that owns itself, or some other entity, some other combination of contracts or something? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Or maybe it seems really simple, but if it's very simple, please tell us how it is. Yes, Farhan.
Yeah, here's something that might just complicate things to a messy degree, but whatever. It might not be as helpful. It might just be more frustrating. But yeah, I mean, I sort of have this intuition, of course, that I don't own the emulation. When it's off and running and has its own thoughts and has its own sort of experiences, then it is its own being. But then I was just thinking, it also has information about me. If it is a full emulation about me, it knows me, and it knows all of my deepest, darkest desires and secrets and things and about my past. And it's like, well, that information's my information technically, kind of. Now it's its, but like, for example, if the emulation were to just start spewing my secrets on the metaverse or whatever, wherever it's going to be living, I will have at least this intuitive response like, no, you can't do that. You can't be giving away information about us, I guess. I don't know. I guess this just complicates it a lot more for me. I'm not sure if other people had this sort of intuition or response, but yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that directly, not explicitly the way you just discussed it, and that's very interesting. To me, it felt like, if you're creating an upload, and of course, the way that we currently think about doing this, you don't survive the uploading process yourself, you're already dead, and then you create a whole brain emulation. But you could make 10 copies then or 20 copies then, and so the same problem exists later. So we still have the same thing we need to talk about. And when I think of it kind of like, well, so you're having a child, and then you're giving them your diary and all of your passwords, and you're telling them run with it. So yeah, there's that. Yeah, that's a interesting conundrum there. Wow. Any more thoughts? Samuel.
And it's not too indifferent from wearing smart glasses, capturing audio and visual information for years on end, and then having a foundation model which you feed this data to, and all of a sudden, it's your AI. Do you own it?
Yeah, great question, especially since these kinds of digital selves of that nature are definitely something that are in the works. Minda.
I think I start to think about like what do the rights of ownership like mean? Like what do they what rights do you or does like the entity or corporation that's hosting like the metaverse, or what rights do the individual copies have, and like what are the potential rights that we're talking about? That's what I really start to wonder about.
Yeah, you can get really fundamental with this, and it's a very good question. So, for example, just let's imagine for a moment that you have been emulated and your data is somewhere and it's running there, and now this company, let's assume it's a company and not a government server that is running all that stuff, the company goes out of business. Maybe that's not very likely if it's a very lucrative business to have all these mind uploads, but maybe for some reason it goes out of business. Now what? Seeing as this data is there, who gets to have it when the company goes out of business? Where do you put it? What's supposed to happen with that? I know it's like I'm making a new topic here, but I feel like it's kind of an extension of this one. Linda, you have your hand up. Is that because you still have a new question? Okay.
I was thinking about what you said, but I hadn't processed it enough to quite have a response yet.
Okay, no problem. Bryce.
Yeah, it seems like you'd want to have some kind of, obviously I'm sure people have thought about this, but some kind of, redundancy so that if a company were to go out of business, that the data remains secure in some way. So maybe there's some kind of like a repository where you put all of this stuff where it's protected. It's sort of accessed there by companies that, all use this repository. That's where they store it. But the repository itself is protected so that when, something happens, there's redundancy there.
And that should probably be mandatory, right? That would be like a government requirement for running a server like that, I assume.
Yeah. And then in that case, if the individual is gone from, whom the copies were made, then you do something like, the family has some kind of right to that information, the children have some kind of right to that information or something like that.
Wait a second, let's back up here. So other people have a right to your own data? Isn't it just that you have to then have the right to be run on another server or something like that? Because we haven't really established this yet, but we have to tackle this question of them being individuals, these uploads.
Yeah, if they're sentient and there's any kind of like consciousness involved, then they should be regarded as individuals, not just sort of information to be accessed by someone.
I see that Mirinda, you put your hand up? No, sorry, not Mirinda. Minda.
Yeah, I'm kind of getting back in, I'm kind of getting back into thinking about like, is there a separation between the data and the uses? And also, is it possible that different stakeholders have different like percentage rights to different types of different versions of the data, and also potential different cases for use?
Very interesting. So like, say, can the company that invested in getting you uploaded use anonymized copies of, say, algorithms that are found in your brain or something else?
Yeah. So, what ownership, like what percentage of ownership do they have over your data, and what they have over for example, if there's like coming back to one of the earlier arguments that were made, like the value of maybe everybody might be that each of us are unique and individual and have different, unique, or you don't know in what individual you might find actually really interesting, like thought algorithm.
Yeah, they go algorithm mining, they uploaded data. Yeah.
Those things, and it also relates back to this question, like who benefits from the value of those things, and are those also in relationship to who fights over those things?
Yeah. I wonder where a sensible trade-off is here, because it might be that trading some of your experience, some of your knowledge, some of what you've seen and done, and maybe other algorithms that exist in your brain is something that a person is willing to do as a way to pay for their upload, and thereby getting around the problem of inequality in a sense, that it's affordable because of that wealth that you're sharing with the world at that point. So, there's probably a really good way to spin this that at least would come across well in the advertising.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it also gets altruistic in a way as well, right? Like, to what degree are you willing to just give that away for potential collective or common good?
Absolutely. That's like the what's it called? The George Church's public DNA project or whatever. I forget what it's called, but yeah. Where you open source your DNA.
The human genome.
Oh, sorry. You were still going. Yeah. Minda, you still had more?
No. You can move on to the next person.
Okay. Richard.
Okay. So I don't know if this is going to be a weird point, but I'm thinking like instead of storing passwords, right? We are storing humans. Now, whether blah 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 they're conscious or not, whatever, not sure yet. But I'm storing these passwords. I'm able to store these passwords locally, or I can have a company store my passwords, right? So, would I be able to store my conscious people locally, and then would I?
Okay, so it's kind of having a cold wallet is your way of, of keeping control of your data, or at least having a copy of your data. That doesn't mean that there aren't other copies of your data floating around out there, which would be unfortunate then, if you didn't want that to be the case. That's interesting. Yeah. So, in an ideal world, you would almost imagine that because we've overcome resource scarcity, then everybody has their own server farm, and we're all completely owning ourselves in that way. And there's no problem like that except for whatever competition comes after that. Yeah. Interesting. Any more thoughts on owning emulations? One thing that I'll just kind of poke you guys with is when people think about mind uploading and they see it as a way to benefit themselves, as a way to continue living or to carry on in some form, whether maybe it seems a little similar to having children or something like that, but oftentimes it's kind of like, I'm making my upload and then that's me. And then if I want to copy myself 10 times, they're all me. And then somehow we all merge back together again and it's me again, which of course assumes that all of those 10 copies would agree to do that if there was even a way to do the merger. They don't change their minds or something, because if they do change their minds, then what? Is it war? I'm kind of asking the question here. So, to think about the idealized version of mind uploading that you have in your mind when you think about it, and then this question of ownership, and whether you see any ways that you would deal with potential problems there. Deb?
I think this is kind of inspired by your comment on the ideal version of mind uploading. I guess one question might be, who has criminal liability for deeds that your copies commit? Like, say, for example, you're digital copy goes and robs a bank or something, then are you to be criminally indicted as well? If that makes sense.
It makes sense to me, that question. And I would say, if I were the judge, I would say, if you made that copy of yourself so that that copy would go rob a bank, in other words, you guys came up with this together, then absolutely. But if not, then I have to give you the kind of leeway that I would give, say, twins who grew up together and like shared an awful lot of their personality, but they're not exactly the same because they have experienced a few different things. But if it was, say, right at the moment of uploading, like you've just, or right at the moment of making a copy of an upload, now you have two individuals and one runs off and robs a bank, then I would have to conclude that this was already a plan that the two of you had, yeah. Not sure if you guys agree. Farhan.
Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering in that case whether, for example, the digital police, there's like 3 copies, and one of the copies decided to run off and rob a digital bank, right? And the digital police have to call, they want to bring that in for questioning. And would I be called in? Could I be called in? I assume I'm one of the copies that didn't do the robbing, because I might have information where they say, look, sure, you didn't do it, but you know a whole lot about motivation and what you were doing and what you were thinking before at such and such time, right? You might have some ideas that could help us out with this investment. You have to be called in. You have to give us all this information about what your copy might have been thinking at the time or how they were thinking about all that kind of stuff. I sort of wonder whether, I couldn't, because the intuition is what we want to say is that's the other copy that did it. I'm not involved here, but I kind of wonder whether there may be some sense in which I could be called in.
This is interesting for, say, the ethical framework on how society should treat uploads, because my first thought was, well, should he be called? Should you, the other copy, be called in to be questioned? Let's just say, well, it is currently the fact that if somebody commits a robbery, they will often question the family of the robber, because one of the things they might want to ask as well, you know him very well, maybe you know where he's hiding. We're trying to catch this person. So it is normal to ask people who know a lot about this other person to bring them in for questioning, at least. Not to punish them automatically, not unless they're hiding that individual, unless they're aiding and abetting. But it's normal to question them. Now, of course, in this case, there's this sort of ramp up where questioning could amount to, now the state has a right to read your mind, to find out everything that you know, because there was this criminal situation. So you give up some of your rights, just like prisoners give up some of their rights right now. That's interesting. Yeah.
I was thinking of a kind of enhanced form of questioning there, or enhanced form of kind of interrogation there. And it's like, okay, I can sort of see why you might think that that's a kind of reasonable approach, but also the alarm bells go off, blaring in your head immediately, like, hey, no, there's something really fishy here. I just feel like my intuitions are kind of pulling me in 2 different ways here. But yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else got any thoughts on this? We still have a few minutes here. Thomas. Thomas, didn't you have your hand up? No. Okay. Oh, his microphone's broken. Well, if you want to put it in chat, you can do that as well, and I'll read it out. And in the meantime, Mirinda.
Yeah, I think this issue of who'd be criminally involved if one of the uploads commits a crime. So how do you distinguish like the moral agent that is the original person versus the upload? Because the upload, say they commit a murder or something, but so they commit that criminal act based upon like the upbringing and the personality traits of the original person. So how do you distinguish between the different moral agents? Are they the same moral agent in some sense, or are they 2 distinct moral agents, and why? So I think this is like a really fascinating philosophical question because the upload is committing some crime based upon the personality that was developed and the temperament and whatnot of the original person. So what is it that makes that person a criminal and not the original?
Yeah, so, and I think the moral agent or moral agency, if you want to ascribe that to someone, this would be linked directly to, say, what we might be calling personal identity at the moment, which is another hairy topic that, of course, when you address that in mind uploading, we have a lot of, some people here have written about branching identity to kind of point out what that's like. If I'm going along the branching identity route here, then to me, as soon as, that's why I was saying if it's a little bit later than immediately after the copy was made, then you would assume that there'd be some difference. And so in some sense, they would no longer be identical, the same person, and then you have different moral agency. I can see where this does still become tricky. And especially if they haven't yet experienced a lot of different things, then you have to wonder, just because, 5 minutes went by and one of them drank coffee doesn't mean that that's a reason for them to go rob a bank when the other one didn't rob a bank, which then leads to all kinds of questions about free will and, other stuff that gets in there. Because if we don't really have free will, because everything is either deterministic or indeterministic, and neither one of those really gives us a chance to do whatever we want, whatever. These are other questions, whole different philosophy. We have maybe another, we're almost out of time, like 20 seconds left if anyone has a last comment or something to add to this topic. Okay, great. Then we'll just move on to the next topic.
Okay, so the recent executive order, President Biden's executive order on AI safety. So the United States government is developing guidelines and standards and best practices for AI safety and security. The full text is available here. I can put that in the chat if anyone would like that. They are tasked with establishing consensus industry standards for developing and deploying safe, secure, and trustworthy AI systems, including a set of guidelines, best practices, companion resources, model security auditing benchmarks, red teaming tests, and model testing environments. There will be a set of AI model evaluation tools to assess an AI model's ability to generate threatening or hazardous outputs, for example, nuclear, biological, chemical, energy security risks to the nation, and to reduce risks to AI technology. As explained in an article to the Federal Register, the government acknowledges broad benefits of open foundation AI models for widespread access and research and development, but also cautions that they can pose risks to security, equity, civil rights, and other harms due to, for instance, affirmative misuse, failures of effective oversight, or lack of clear accountability mechanisms. Others argue that these open foundation models enable development of attacks against proprietary models due to similarities in the data sets used to train them. Companies developing dual-use foundation models will need to regularly provide the federal government with information and reports about their training and development, including the physical and cybersecurity protections in place for those models, the ownership and possession of the model weights and their protection, the results of the model performance during AI red teaming testing based on NIST guidance, and a description of any associated safety measures taken. Lastly, anyone who acquires, develops, or possesses a potential large-scale computing cluster is required by law to report that, as well as its location and total computing power. Technical thresholds will be set for the reporting requirement. At present, these thresholds are any model trained using 10 to the 26 integer or floating point operations, any model using primarily biological sequence data and computing power greater than 10 to the 23rd operations, any cluster of co-located machines with greater than 10 gigabits per second interconnects and theoretical maximum compute capacity of 10 to the 20 operations for AI training. So these are sort of the prompts of the questions. So what stance should any take with regard to open versus closed foundation models, given the balance of benefits and risks? So open and closed foundation models that Carbon Copies works with or is developing. So do we know how the organization plans to use AI models in the development of whole brain emulation technology? So that sort of relates to, are we going to have to report to the government the models that we're training? Let's see here. What is Carbon Copies' awareness of these tools and obligations? How will those be incorporated in Carbon Copies Foundation collaborative whole brain emulation projects or any projects Carbon Copies is involved with developing dual use foundation AI models? And what plans should we have for red teaming our models and testing them against external information security risks? And red teaming, if anyone doesn't know, it just means you're testing the security of your AI model against.
Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. Sorry, thank you. I know this was a really long one to read out because of all of the details in that order that already exists. But really, the most fundamental and first question is just this issue of closed versus open. I think after that, it's more of a question of abiding by the rules that are there and knowing that you're doing so. But I guess the first question is not so much what is the rule, but what should the rule be, or do we agree with this rule that the U.S. has taken? Maybe other countries are going to do different things. So it's really a question of what should the rules be that protect us here? And yes, these were meant for AI, but they of course also apply to all of the machine learning that's going on in neuroscience. So open versus closed. And I had at first thought my default assumption is open is great, because open means so many eyes, you see all the problems, everybody's working together, more level playing field, not as many incentives for, some company somewhere to just take everything that they can and leave nothing for anyone else. Just socially better in a sense. And then the points that were raised about, you can use this open data to then do malicious attacks on others and all that stuff kind of came up. But now I've also heard some really good counter arguments. And before we get into that, though, I quickly want to ask, Thomas, I forgot to call on you again. You said that you had fixed your mic. Did you want to briefly talk about the previous question? Just mention what you had wanted to say, or do you want to get into this one?
Sure. We can just go to this one. It's all right.
Okay. You want to start?
It's not super important. Well, sure. I personally think we should default open, because otherwise it feels like we're taking kind of a security through obscurity approach, which never really works. It might work for a while until, you say, okay, we want to protect the models and make sure only the company and its members have access to it. Well, if the argument here is, but a foreign government might misuse AI, they could still either hack that company and take the weights. They could build their own if they're sufficiently large. So it's like all you're doing is making it so that people who could also, researchers that would be developing ways to mitigate harm will now have a harder time getting access to the thing that they're trying to defend against. So the only thing you're doing is shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, I think one thing that you mentioned that when we talked about this earlier, that was really, that really got to me was sort of pointing out the difference between what, say, the researchers who are really trying to understand the risks and who are trying to do something about a problem. They have access only to that which they have legally access to because they have to stick to the law, because they want to publish their work and all of that. So they're going to be doing this legally. But any malicious actor who wants to, say, do industrial espionage and run away with the code or something, or run away with the model weights, they don't have to stick to that. So in a situation where the code is closed, it feels like that gives an advantage to the malicious actors.
Exactly. And of course you can go, but they'll put better protections in place, and that's just a failure of the protections. But again, that's still the security through obscurity approach, right? So the same thing applies. You could take that same argument and apply it to anything not related to AI. And we saw.
I'm curious if anyone has a different perspective on this. Richard.
I'm not sure if this is like a direct, like, one-to-one, but, like when it comes to, Bitcoin, there's like a, you know, it's, we're doing, or I don't exactly know how Bitcoin security works, but in that space, everything is open, right? Or like the handshakes are open. And so it hasn't really worked out in that space that much to have that open floor of, and for some reason we have decided, okay, let's have our financial systems stay bounded with US regulatory laws. And so I don't know if open versus closed is exactly, or is, I don't know if it's just black and white. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like it's.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. That's an interesting counterpoint. Yeah. These cryptocurrencies generally are based on open code and on open processes on the blockchain, and yet there's plenty of malicious stuff that happens. So the question is, does it have anything to do with the fact that they're open or closed? And other banking is done on closed systems, on closed servers, with closed code. Everything is secret. Yeah, interesting counterpoint, yeah. I'd be interested if anyone here has a bit of expertise in these areas and maybe can chime in, because Thomas is saying something. But in chat, there's also plenty of malicious stuff that goes on with regular closed banking. Yeah, but we just don't know how much. Okay. Sorry, who was just speaking just a second ago?
Sorry, I was telling Thomas to speak up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, if his mic is working. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was just had a mouthful of food. Yeah, so I don't know if that's necessarily a counterargument, because again, I'd argue that plenty of malicious things goes on in closed banking systems. We may not know how much of it goes on, right? The reporting requirements are different, and since it's all closed and opaque, stuff might happen that isn't reported, and how would anyone know about it? We wouldn't, right? So even though, yes, you can say there's a bunch of crime that goes on Bitcoin because it's open, people can trace it around, that kind of thing, sure. And to be fair, I'm not arguing for cryptocurrency. However, I would also say cryptocurrencies and open models are very different. I would argue models are closer to large code bases and that type of thing, which is not just moving around money, you know. And open source projects like Linux and that kind of thing, you tend to see that sort of collaborative behavior. I don't know how you can really collaborate on money. Like, it's not really something you can contribute to other than, you know, giving people money, moving it around. It's, you know, it's kind of a different thing. If that makes sense.
So you'd say it's more like openly publishing research because the research was funded by, tax dollars, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess it's closer to something like that than, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have enough insight into this risk trade-off. My gut feeling says open, but I can't properly describe that besides that issue of, well, in the open case, everyone can see it. In the closed case, only those who create it and those who steal it. But yeah, not sure.
I would be curious, what would people have arguments for keeping it closed? Because I haven't...
You mean other arguments besides what the government put in their writing?
Yeah. Or does anyone have supporting, points for that?
Okay, so maybe if we make it a very clear example, like, is there a reason why it's better if OpenAI is a closed for-profit company rather than, say, an open source company?
Sure.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people would say that the main reason for them to be a closed company is perhaps not even actually a risk question, although that may be the way it gets spun, but it might be an investment question, like the closed company built the way it is now provides an avenue for people to get a lot of profit out of it. And so there's a higher motivation to invest in it and work on that. I think that might be part of the answer there, which really isn't a risk versus benefits trade-off question, or a different benefit. Right, does anyone have anything else they want to talk about this question, about this topic? Deb.
I actually have a question. What does dual use foundation AI models mean? Sorry for being, this might be a bit naive, but yeah, I just wanted to clarify that.
Miranda, do you happen to have the official definition of that handy? You're still on mute, though.
Hang on, I will find it.
Okay. I mean, if it's just large language models that are used in chatbots, I guess open versus closed, I would say a lot of, like, from what this is not my opinions, by the way, this is what I've read. For the case of large language models, I would suggest even like companies like Facebook, they have open source their source code for their large language models, and it turns out that it is better for them as well because it promotes competitiveness and it promotes the research, and yeah, it benefits the open source community as well. That's why I would vote for an open model versus a closed model. That's my stance on this.
It looks like both Richard and Miranda found definitions of dual use foundation model, which, as I'm reading it, to me seems to just mean a model that wasn't built to be able to carry out just one task or carry out one thing, but something that can be applied to multiple purposes. So it's not really dual, it's more like multi, at least the way I'm reading it. Am I reading that wrong? Does anybody know? And Alex is saying, my confusion is the word dual. Yeah, what are the two uses? Yeah, see, I'm also reading that as multi rather than dual. But it could just be that the terminology is a bit outdated or something. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yes, so I guess from my interpretation of that definition, a large language model will be a very good example of what it is trying to say. A model that uses self-supervision, is very big in size, is applicable over a wide range of contexts, and exhibits or modified. Yeah, so a large language model would fit into that description pretty well.
If we're having trouble wrapping our heads around it just from the perspective of what do we know about which approach would make for a better future, because it's hard to predict those things, it could perhaps be helpful if we considered who is arguing for which of them. And I don't know that we know this. I know that this executive order was created in collaboration with the very large companies that are currently running large AI models, such as OpenAI and Google and Microsoft and the others. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're the main proponents. I don't know who actually came out and said, we should do this, and say how many people are voting for that approach versus a different approach. So I'm asking this because my gut feeling, that may just be based on, experience in society, may be that, all the poor researchers, of course, want everything to be open, but anyone who's, say, founding a company and trying to build a big AI model or a big whole brain emulation approach or something would prefer it to be closed, because then they can go to investors and say, invest in me, this is going to be very valuable. If it's open, maybe people are just going to copy that and the Chinese are going to take it and make it there. So in my head, I'm thinking that very often these sorts of things might not even be best practices based on really totally looking at what's going to create the best future, but more based on today and what, the players who are coming up with these orders or who are talking to the White House, what they're coming up with. I wonder how anyone else here feels about that, if anyone has any thoughts or knows who was behind all this. Yes, Richard?
I think they had a big meeting with all the AI CEOs, and then they came up with this executive order. I think that's what happened. So I guess this is company, or the government didn't really decide, or like the government like agreed, but like they're just like yes, that's what it should be from the companies. So I'm not really sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm really curious if other countries would come up with the same kind of executive order or a different one, or wouldn't have one, say the European Union, or maybe they have one and I'm just not aware of it. So maybe Samuel, you might know that from your European and UK experiences.
Yeah, I'm afraid not. I don't know whether there's an equivalency.
All right. If there are no other comments, yes, go ahead, Samuel.
Well, I was half coughing, half thinking about what I'm trying to say, but there was apologies if this was already discussed, but there was some set of questions about why keep it closed source, or what are the other advantages aside from competitive advantage or investment purposes advantages of keeping something closed source. I think, maybe this was already mentioned, but there is a risk reduction element inherent in closed source software or solutions or ideas of any kind, that somebody doesn't go and run wild with a version that is not meant to be running wild, right? So you may release the model for a successful mouse simulation, and then some less diligent, rigorous actors in this space will going to take that and apply it to a human, and we're going to end up with a disaster and set the whole field back a decade or more. Was that mentioned already?
That is actually in the list of points, is this sort of nefarious or malicious misuse of the open information. And yeah, when you say it in the terms of an animal or a human and whole brain emulation, you can hear how that sounds really serious. If somebody goes and runs off with your data, there's that whole, if it's the weights of the model, and in the end the weights are our synapses and it's the brain, we're back to the ownership of whole brains, right? Thomas.
Hey, I'm sorry. I just wanted to argue your point saying it's inherently safer. I really disagree, because if you look at where most large-scale, like, data leaks, breaches, that kind of thing happen, like look at SolarWinds, it's all from these proprietary sort of applications, because then since there's a single entity that controls the whole thing, if they get compromised, like everyone else, it just carries down. And like the SolarWinds, they were able to distribute malware to thousands of organizations because they all use this one piece of management software.
Mm-hmm.
Had that been an open and like open source thing, first thing, like you wouldn't have been able to release an update that had malicious code, most likely, because someone would have caught it. Especially large organizations using it would probably audit the code before they install it, but since it's proprietary, you can't. So I don't agree with that fundamental thing that it's more safe to do it in a like hidden and secretive way, because I think you're just relying on security through obscurity, which will fail at some point no matter how careful you are. So you only have to get lucky once.
Yeah, I get that argument. that is a good extra argument is that not just of having a level playing field between malicious and good actors, but also that if you have just one version of commercial code and nobody's allowed to fix it or fork it, then you're going to have the same, bugs everywhere. But I'm now also really wondering, and I know that Samuel, you have more to say, but I'm now curious, now that I'm just putting it directly in terms of, say, this emulated mouse or emulated human. If we're talking about that as the large model with all the weights, not just an ML that was used to create that or to do the uploading or to do the analysis of the neuroscience, but that model itself, because that's something that would fall under this order, right? I'm curious, Thomas, would you like your brain with all of its weights to be open source?
Personally, no. However, I don't think that's necessarily relevant for. What I'm not saying is you shouldn't, everything should be open. What I am saying is you should be able to make it open. There should be no restrictions.
Okay.
If you want to.
Okay, great. Yeah, that does, and it wraps right back to one of our other topics. Yeah. Samuel, did you have something you wanted to still add to this? Because I know Thomas had kind of responded to you.
Oh, yeah. We can continue this. I like that a lot, back and forth. So I'll just clean up.
So we don't have time.
Yeah, no, I like that. So I did not make the claim that it was safer, just that there were inherent risks with having open source software. But I would say that personally I'm more favoring your opinion, Thomas. However, there have also been, very recently, breaches where you have been able to push a malicious piece of code, spyware, in through open source projects unnoticed, and that has affected hundreds of thousands of distributions of Linux recently. This was in the news just 2 weeks ago. So it is not that you would be preventing it, it's just that you would have more eyes on the code with open source software, wouldn't you say?
Right, yes. That is a good counterpoint, and right, yeah, I agree. It's not like it would be a magic bullet that would fix it. It would just, in theory, make it less likely to happen.
So it seems like it's a bit of a nuanced question, this whole thing. And that makes it interesting to me that the way the order is written tries to be nuanced in the sense that they're putting thresholds there. They're putting a cutoff there. So they're not applying the order to every AI model, but they're applying it to AI models that have that exceed certain thresholds. And now the thing, of course, where we're looking at it and going, wait a second, this could apply to us, is that the types of ML that we might use to analyze brain data might exceed those thresholds. And almost certainly some of the early uploads would, because before we learn enough about the brain to really, make very efficient code, you're going to have a very, very large code base, and it'll look a lot like an ML model of sorts with a whole bunch of weights. So this might apply directly to a brain, which would then say, it's not the version of the world where all the brains are made open. It's the other one where all the brains have to be closed, so that Thomas's desire for you to be allowed to make it open wouldn't apply. And then there's the reporting function. I'm also not 100% sure that the aspect of it having to be closed, that was a real dictate, or if that's just a preference. But they certainly do have all these reporting requirements and a necessity of putting in place all kinds of safety measures, which I think are meant to be safety measures not to be able to access the weights, which then would just mean they need to be closed. Yes, Thomas?
Oh yeah, I think you basically already said what I was going to say, but later on in their executive order, they did mention something like they would be considering the pros and cons to open models, and so it sounded like they could at some point in theory go, oh yeah, never mind, we don't like open models, everything's got to be closed. And it's like, I'm sure there'd be workarounds like, oh, it's closed, but anyone who emails me is part of our organization, so they can get the data. So like, you could probably bypass it, but it's like, you shouldn't have to do that, because then they might put more restrictions, and then yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if we can work our way through this whole problem, but it's just an interesting one, this topic, because it is actually based on something that is already, something they're trying to apply. And so it's kind of like showing you the inroads, the beginnings of where all these complicated questions are going to be resolved in one way or another by the government making its way through them. Yeah, so we don't have to solve this right now, and we have, of course, run a little over time. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here anyway. I do want to give anyone who wants to have a last word on this you still have a chance to make a comment before we wrap up. I'm guessing this means we've all had our say. So again, I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm going to stick around a little bit just in case anyone wants to stick around to prod me with some suggestions about, I really didn't like this format, this is terrible, or something like that. You can just tell me, because as you know, this is just our first attempt at something like this, and our next one is going to be the one that is run by Anders Sandberg, and we will have a number of experts in different fields participating, and I assume that our topics are going to be different as well. Or maybe not, some of them might be the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What an amazing event.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.